Greetings and welcome to episode 20 of A Plain Accounts web series, where every week we take a look at least one of that week's lectionary passages. Today, joined with us as usual, Ben Kramer. Ben, do you want to say hello?
Hey, it's good to be here as always.
And we also have with us one of our contributors, Phil Hamner. Phil, would you say hello, introduce yourself to us a little bit, let us know about yourself.
Hello, good to be with you. I am the senior pastor at the Overland Park Church of the Nazarene in Overland Park, Kansas. Been the senior pastor for 15 years, and so have enjoyed my time there. I've been a pastor in the Church of the Nazarene for 27 years, serving in 4 different congregations. I'm working on my PhD in theology through the University of Manchester in Manchester, England, currently. So, in the midst of writing a thesis as well.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have you here. If you've not yet read Phil's essay on A Plain Account over John 10, you need to go do so. It's a wonderful, wonderful essay. Thanks for writing that. It's already informed how I will be preaching this week. So let's go ahead and read John 10, 22 through 30, the Gospel Lection for the 4th Sunday of Easter, which is also called Good Shepherd Sunday. So John 10, 22 through 30. At the time of the festival of the dedication, at that time the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." Jesus answered, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one." The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, so this is a brief passage. This is a brief pericope. It's kind of in the middle of a bigger story. What is going on? What do we need to know about this? Historical, literary context, what's important for us?
We have a lot of contextual elements in the first few verses. We realize that it is winter, which is rare in the Gospel of John. It's during the time of the Festival of Dedication, which is what we would call Hanukkah in modern time. And it is the Festival of the Booths, where it represents God's protection and refuge in the wilderness. And you have Jesus standing in the portico of Solomon, which would be a refuge during the wind and the cold and the storm of the winter period there. So you have a significant theme of God's refuge and protection taking place that would be in the minds of all the Jews that were standing there listening to Jesus, remembering what God had done, the provision in the wilderness, and what Jesus has been trying to say all of chapter 10 as a shepherd, as one who provides refuge and protection. So that's what would be going through their minds contextually, remembering their time in the desert of their ancestors, and coming to ask Jesus this question at the portico of Solomon.
So and then it's in the middle of a larger narrative that deals with this theme of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. It sort of culminates in verse 11 of chapter 10 with the I am passage, I am the Good Shepherd. So one of the classic passages that is an identifier, as John does in multiple places in the Jesus narratives, but it begins with a discussion of the nature of the way in which a shepherd functions for the sheep. So we're talking about protection, we're talking about security, we're talking about well-being, we're talking about finding a location where the sheep can be protected from the elements and from the wild, so from wolves or whatever that might try to take their lives. So much of what you see early in the chapter is a discussion of the nature of what it means to be a shepherd. Remarkably here, though, in verse 22, we don't have the word shepherd. We don't have any reference to shepherd. We have a reference to the sheep. So what Jesus has done in the first section, talking about himself as the Good Shepherd, he now just takes on that mantle and that identity and begins to function as the Good Shepherd in saying, my sheep know my voice. So while it's not quite the same as what you get in the first part of the chapter, in the second part of the chapter here, and towards the end, you're now getting him functioning in that role. And there, as we will see, if you read after verse 30, there's enormous risk for the shepherd. They're ready to kill him, and that identifies with the risks that a shepherd would have in protecting their flock, just in typical everyday living in the Near East.
Which, it's interesting, in the research that I've done, the reason they end up wanting to kill him isn't necessarily because he claims to be the Messiah, because there are different understandings of what the Messiah is going to be. It's because he says, the Father and I are one. And I wonder if it's also because of what he says in verse 26, you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's speaking to a Jewish crowd here. How dare he say they don't belong?
Yeah.
I mean, they're the in crowd.
Yeah, he's actually unseating two basic things that are happening, and you're right to identify that. The first thing is he is connecting himself to the Father, which is no one would have done that, and it's so audacious that it seems blasphemous to them that he's done that. And then the second thing is that by connecting him to the Father, he's connecting his mission and purpose in the world to the Father's, and that removes the Jews from the notion or identity that they're the people who are to carry out the mission of God. He's already moved himself into the role of being the one now who will carry out the mission of God. And so they are outsiders because they've made themselves outsiders in this moment, and that's so infuriating to them.
And one thing that I think that's really interesting here, the relationship between belief and belong here. I think typically in the North American church we would say you don't belong because you don't believe.
Right.
Belief precedes belonging here. In a lot of our world, we think that in order to belong, you have to first believe the right way. But Jesus says you don't believe because you don't belong. Belonging precedes believing properly, evidently.
And what's so interesting,
First.
so interesting in what you say, I mean, it's so true, is the dialogue that's taking place before they ask Jesus to tell him plainly that he is the Messiah. They don't know if he's demon possessed. They don't know if he is one sent by God. So they are making Jesus prove himself to their understanding rather than submitting their understanding to who Jesus says he is. It's a interplay of surrender and submission as well. They are the ones who have assumed themselves to be the authority that even the Son of God has to answer to, rather than the other way of saying, I will be humble and come to you and let you tell me and take the evidence that you are giving me as the signs that you are saying that you are the Son of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Phil, could you chat just a brief moment about you when we were talking prior to going live? You were talking about no one will snatch them out of my hand. Kind of the ways in which we've interpreted this through kind of the Wesleyan Arminian way in which we do that versus the Reformed understanding, and maybe how we can be approaching that particular understanding. Yeah,
I suspect that for Nazarene pastors who use the lectionary, they're really anxious about a passage like this, because we know how we've heard a passage like this used in the past, and in our context, typically Nazarene preachers or Wesleyan Arminian preachers do a lot of apologizing almost for what's being said here, and on the other side, in sort of the Calvinist tradition, this has been one of those places where you just sort of sit down and say, see, this is what I told you. There's nothing that can happen ever that could take you out of God's hands. And I think the framing of that is completely wrong. What we ought to be thinking about is the fact that what Jesus is really saying here is that there is a God who actually loves us so desperately that he will pursue us and never stop pursuing us. And so that when we belong to him, he will fiercely guard and protect us. And so instead of asking the question, oh, well, how far can I go before it's too far in my life? Is there a sin I can commit that simply takes me out of his hand? Instead of asking those questions, we ought to be looking at what the text says and the surrounding area of the text. And what he's saying to them is that if you belong to me, you would know that nothing's ever going to happen to you that's going to take you out of the Father's love and care. But you don't. And so he's actually challenging people who are religious and believe that their religiosity and that their identity secures them in the kingdom. And what secures us in the kingdom is not our religiosity, our family heritage, the nation state in which we are born, the denomination that we are a part of. What secures us in the kingdom of God is that the Father and the Son desire to seek and save the lost. And so they come and they receive us. Now the question is, why are these Jews not able to be a part of this group? Does he call them outsiders? It's not because he doesn't want them. It's because their actions have placed them outside of his activity. They've called him false. They're ready to kill him. They're trying to find ways to catch him in a lie or catch him making a mistake. They're seeing the very work of God and they're calling it blasphemy.
Yeah.
And so that takes them outside of this.
That's so true.
And how much better of a word is that than the typical application of this passage?
Absolutely.
Than how far, what can I do and still be within the fold?
Right.
And I've heard it said you lose your soul a little bit at a time. You never lose your soul all at once. You give just a little here and then a little there. And so that's an inappropriate application of this passage, as might also be the Calvinistic application of C. It's all preordained.
Yeah. Yeah,
it
sitting there
communicates an ongoing relationship. I think that sets the frame for understanding judgment and reconciliation within the context of an ongoing relationship, rather than everything is preordained at the beginning, and that's what's going to play out. God is to reconcile and to be with us and to have us belong to him in an ongoing relationship, and that's how we should see that judgment and reconciliation take place. That's excellent.
Yeah, the other thing I would say then, in the context of a more Calvinist reading of this, that at least a more rigid reading of this, let's not paint big pictures about everybody that might be Calvinist, but someone who might see this as a justification that there's nothing I can do that would take me out of the hand of God, actually is recognizing or assenting to the idea that I'm the arbiter of my own salvation, and I determine what I can do. And the bigger partner in our covenant with God is always God. And if you're now telling God what he can and cannot do, that becomes a problem for you on that side. So that's
Right.
why I think we need a new thinking. Really take this text for what it says in its context and not try to build something else out of it.
Absolutely. Well, in the last in the next 10 minutes or so that we have left, let's ask the question: how do we preach this? What are some ways that we can make this text approachable and applicable in the lives of our congregations?
Well, I think one of the most petrifying things to me, I remember reading this text in seminary, and I was sitting in the library, and one of the most petrifying things to me was the people of God standing there. It's not pagans that are standing there. It's the people of God standing there talking to the Son of God, and they did not recognize him for who he was. And that really set a tone of fright in my heart, that if Jesus was standing right in front of me and telling me that, his sheep hear his voice, would I recognize that? Or what sort of things would prevent me from hearing his voice and belonging to Jesus? So I think, at least initially in my sermon, I would use that sort of testimony to say, do we have a sort of healthy fear of what things we might be putting in place that prevents us from recognizing the Son of God, prevents us from recognizing who and who's speaking to us through the voice of God?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
You can really build on that, the voice. I think this is a way that we can really make it approachable. And Phil, you did that in your essay. You talked about the cacophony of where you were seated for dinner with your wife under this dome. And I think everybody can relate to those times when we have these this just plethora of voices, and trying to discern one within them can be rather difficult.
Yeah, and not only difficult, but can create in us a sense that all these voices all have a rightful place in our lives, and that's probably where I would want to sort of set down for a while with my congregation to say, if Jesus is your Lord, then there just aren't any other voices you need to be hearing, and to talk about what other voices keep demanding place in our lives, and how those voices need to be told no, and that we need to ignore those voices. If when I've been preaching for 27 years, my son is 18. When he was an infant, it was the only time I've ever been able to hear a baby in church and know that was my kid, because you know your kid's voice. But everybody else would be worried about their baby crying in church, and I would say, I don't hear it, because I really didn't. Because I was trained to listen for one voice, and I knew when Evan was crying that he was hungry, or when he was sick, or when something wasn't right. That's the way in which I think Christian life has to be lived. We listen for a voice that we know is authentic and genuine and true. And that authentic and genuine and true voice of Jesus is tested and made real in our lives by study of Scripture, by prayer, by the community of saints that enable us and encourage us in worship. We test whether or not we think we're hearing Jesus against the means of grace, and the means of grace help us to understand what voice we're actually hearing.
Right, absolutely.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, you're talking about your son, and I think of my wife. I could hear her voice anywhere. And I think we all have those kind of relationships, those people that we have in our life that will always know that one voice. And I think the plethora of voices speaking into our lives and listening to the proper one is an incredibly important word. And you could even name those voices in your congregation. Are you not that sports are bad, but do you listen to the voice of the God of sports more than you listen to the voice of Jesus, the Son of God? Do you listen to the voice of the super mall, the Walmart or the mall or the supermarket more than you listen to the voice of the Son of God?
Right.
You could even name what those voices are and let people see how they are pulling at them and how they're listening to them rather than listening to this other voice, to the one voice.
Yeah, when you go to name these voices, I think we should expect there's going to be pushback, and we should expect that there's going to be perhaps anger or frustration because we've named something that someone is listening to. So the preacher has to be careful here that you haven't identified or gone after an individual, but that what you've done is identified a risk, and sometimes the risk can be identified in your own life. My son played soccer all the way through school, and soccer and baseball just want to compete on Sundays with church on a continual basis. They want to compete with youth group on Wednesday nights. You don't want your kid to be deprived of having this activity in their life. But as a family, you do have to sit down and say, all right, who's in charge of the future here? And I remember going to a meeting for a competitive team that my son might be playing for, and the first thing the guy said was, you all need to know something. You're parents, but we're in charge of your kids' schedules from now on. And I got up and walked out, and I said, my son will never play for that person or that group ever. And I think this is the pressure that many of our families are under, that if their kid doesn't get on that team and doesn't get in this place, they won't make it in life and they won't excel. And so those voices have become the real life voices that have just rationalized Jesus right out of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And what a dangerous place to live. Precariously putting your hopes and dreams on the success or failure of your kids in sports or other activities that might be similar to it. If you want to pick up the sort of commercial capitalist marketing kind of concern, I mean, let's take Black Friday and talk about that. Families build traditions around getting up and going early to Black Friday in the middle of what has been a family holiday and a time for families to spend together in more meaningful ways. So
Right.
what are we to say? What are we to say to that? Why is that a necessary aspect of our lives?
And I've been reading through Walter Brueggemann's Sabbath as Resistance again, and his dialogue on Sabbath, I think, is an important word in hearing the right voice.
Yeah.
Sabbathing, if you can make that a tense, allows us to hear the right voice, and it frees us from the rat races of this life. And he talks about how participating in Sabbath frees us from the temptation or the desire to think that our kids aren't going to make it in this world if they're not in sports on Sunday morning. That we don't allow our children to have a Sabbath. Well, what does that say about our understanding of who our God is? In terms of God's, if we can bring it back to this, in terms of us being within the fold of Jesus' sheep.
Right.
Do we believe that we'd be better off if we're a sheep of Jesus than if we were a good soccer player on Sunday mornings?
Yeah, I think that's true.
I think my mind goes to the single people in our congregation, those who may be widows and or homebound, where they are kind of isolated from folks, and some people are just isolated from their own decisions. They prefer this sort of self-sufficient individuality that's so pervasive in our culture. And something that you said, Phil, before we went live was talking about the absurdity of this question, are you the Messiah? With these obvious gifts from God that are in their midst, the booths, the refuge, this very pervasive love and compassion that is just so evident in their context. And I can think of several gifts that are so present but are just so diminished and devalued in our context. There's a church on every corner. Like there is a community of believers gathering on Sunday mornings wherever we live. There are endless sort of resources, but we in the midst of that almost deluge and glut of spiritual resources that are right at our fingertips, we still have the absurdity or the audacity to say, God, are you here providing for me? Are you here? Are you going to take care of me? Are you going to be my refuge? And I think understanding that sort of absurdity is important with the provision, the obvious provision that we may just look over when we want our own understanding to be satisfied, rather than going and submitting and belonging to the voice of God in our culture.
Something that I never thought I wasn't aware that I might see, and that is in the last probably decade of ministry with senior adults, those at the end of their life, and those who have been in our tradition and in our churches their whole life, hit the road and are on the road towards their own death, and the sort of physical changes that happen to them and the struggles that happen to them because of illness of various kinds, dementia, cancer, you name it. But there's been a common thread of real, genuine questions that these folks have asked, and they would not say it exactly as I've said it, but it is implied in what they're saying, and it is this: I've served God all of my life. How can He let this happen to me? He owes me something better. At first it shocked me, but then I realized this is really a genuine question. A question about what good does our life in Christ actually get us. And so I don't know that I've worked out the way in which I deal with that fully yet, but the direction I'm starting to head in pastoral care with that is to be mindful that we're only at a point in this journey and that it's not over, and that though these are not the way we expected things to end, what could we have expected? We're all going to face this at some point, but that the shepherd does not leave the sheep, so he's with you even to the bitter end. And to help them be free from feeling the guilt of even saying out loud, how dare he do this to me? And so maybe that's where we might sit down with the language of the sheep know my voice and nothing will snatch them out of my hand kind of language. Maybe that's where that comes in.
Right. Absolutely. Well, any final words before we close our time? Any last things that you think we need to address before we end this episode? Well, Phil, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for your wonderful contribution in the essay, and then also thanks for your great contribution on the episode today. It's been a privilege to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to do it.
Yeah, and Ben, great to be with you as always.
As with you, Danny.
On this fourth Sunday of Easter, on the Good Shepherd Sunday, you'll be reading Psalm 23. You'll be reading from John 10, reading about the sheep knowing Christ's voice, and you'll be reading from Acts, the church, the first church, the beginning of the church, and then you'll be reading from Revelation. And in all of this, we see that God has always been present and will always be present. In the language of Revelation, the one who was and is to come. And this is the shepherd. So preach well about this one who is always with us and who is always drawing us in what we would call the prevenient grace of Christ, knowing that we can never be too far from the love of Christ. And preach well that incredible love of the resurrected Christ to your congregation on this Sunday. Great to be with you all. Peace be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.